Currently, the front pages of Reddit, the forums, social media, including this comment section, are absolutely filled with frustration about Destiny. Whether it's Trials of Osiris, seasonal content concerns, or indeed frustration about repetition in the game, as well as bugs and a whole host of other issues, over the past few months, but especially since the start of Season 10, it feels like the sentiment around the game has been sloping off into a broadly more negative place. Some of the top Destiny Reddit threads we've ever seen at the moment consist of conversation over whether Destiny is even a major priority for Bungie, or whether they're working on different stuff, and obviously, if players are asking themselves that question, it probably does say some fairly concerning things about player sentiment around Destiny. I would say that overall, it seems like the formula that Bungie are using to produce content is something that's going to have to adapt much more moving forward. Especially if we look at a year 4 of Destiny 2, I think most of us can agree at the moment that there are a number of repetitive issues which need to be innovated on for the health of the game moving forward. So we are going to analyze some of the core problems right here. Of course, we can't discuss absolutely everything in one video, and so that's where it comes down to you guys to let us know your thoughts down in the comment section. The top standout problems for Destiny, the things that make you not want to play it, or indeed the things that you think really do work and Bungie should be doing more of. Give us your thoughts down below, but nonetheless, we're going to do our best to dissect some of these key issues. Let's speak about PvE and general endgame, because a lot of this grind has already grown repetitive over the past few seasons. We've said it here on the channel for the past 2 seasons especially, that things have started to feel like they're becoming pretty stale, but a majority of players who play season over season now genuinely do find themselves being turned off by having to grind bounties. And that's an especially big one, but also upgrades and repeating very basic activities to unlock rewards, which are also failing to create some of the excitement that they should. We have spoken numerous times about narrow seasonal activity content, and for this season, Seraph Towers is a very basic offering. If you're watching this video, then you probably already know how that works. And I don't think Seraph Towers is horrible as a thing to do to get some stuff, right? You know, in the same way that we could grab a couple of random weapons or artifacts from the Archon's Forge in Destiny 1. It's the kind of content that's okay when it's part of something much bigger, right? But in itself, for the moment, despite the bunkers themselves being pretty cool thematically, the actual loop of farming a currency, unlocking upgrades to ultimately farm out a handful of weapons is definitely tired at this point, and unfortunately this season's core content highlights that again. But it does feel as well like it's compounded by the fact that we still have an ever-creeping power, artifact, and season pass grind, which feels like it's templated, right? Either way, I think that part of the problem is that we're repeating our grind over and over in nearly the same ways season over season, aside from relatively minor mechanic changes. But it isn't just repetition. Of course, we've had a lot of repetition through the course of Destiny since D1 launched, but I feel like incentivization in Destiny 2 is a big problem, and this has proven to be the case in a few different areas in the game. Yet again, it feels like there are missed opportunities with rewards. And let's face it, the season pass armor that we get season over season doesn't really feel very special, right? We get it dropped in activities or via the pass itself. You know, even if you like wearing it, that's cool, but it isn't like collecting raid armor or something like that, right? We're not making that connection with the loot that we're collecting, and that kind of makes sense. But as a sideline about loot, I feel the exact same way about the Garden of Salvation raid gear. It doesn't really feel very special, because we know that it's a reskin of older Eververse armor. And of course there can be exceptions there, but versus collecting the godlike armors of old, especially the Age of Triumph ornamented raid armor in D1, once again, the loot prestige does feel very different in the game now. And I know that's an example that we use a lot, definitely not trying to beat a dead horse, but it's a good example because that content paid dividends in D1. Over and over again. And so naturally, if some of our pinnacle and best endgame gear inside of Destiny 2 is failing to do that, then obviously we are going to have the same problem with seasonal gear as well. And that isn't an entirely isolated example of loot in the game not being interesting enough. If we look at the relatively small pool of new weapons that we get for this season, we unlock them by doing upgrades on the bunkers, like we did in the Menagerie, or from the obelisks. Some of these weapons bring something pretty neat to the table in terms of perk combinations and archetypes and things like that, but then again, the sense of loot being special or rare is kind of missing with these weapons, with the exception of maybe getting one of the couple of very tasty potential rolls on them. I know we've spent a bit of time talking about loot right there, but I think it is a fairly significant issue for Destiny on the whole. It by far is not the only problem with Destiny, but broadly I think there is a sense from players that loot is largely less interesting than it has been and than it should be, and naturally that has a knock-on effect on players actually wanting to invest in that stuff. We can use some specific examples of how loot could be made more interesting. So this season in the sandbox, one of the coolest things Bungie have done is introducing Warmind cells. Yes, they are simply orange balls which fly out of enemies for a number of different reasons, but as we've discussed in some build videos, they're actually a lot of fun to play around with, doing things like granting overshields, damaging arc pulses, disorienting debuffs, damage buffs, and more. Obviously, I'm not trying to go into massive depth on how they work right here, but when you think about the capability of Warmind cells and what they actually do, you can potentially see missed opportunities for Bungie to innovate. You know, what if instead of having Warmind cell mods, Bungie instead created 3 exotic class items, all of them with a Warmind theme. They could drop in the Seraph Towers, they could be upgraded, it could be a kind of little part of that endgame loop for the season. And essentially we could just collect Warmind cell mods or perks that would be equipped on the exotic class item instead of on our armor and via the Seraph weapons. And I think people would be paying a lot more attention in general to Warmind cells, but also, instead of simply being mods, Warmind cells functionality could actually become part of the loot system relatively easily. And I'm not really the kind of player that likes to make demands, right? But the one thing I would echo that a lot of people in the community are talking about is Bungie's ability to create cosmetics to sell in Eververse, right? If they can do all of that, but equally in the sandbox, they can also create Warmind cells and these cool kind of functionalities. Of course, 2 different parts of development entirely. And I do think it's a massive shame that Bungie can't put an extra 5% resources into saying, hey, instead of making these 2 or 3 sparrows, could we invest that time into making a really cool cosmetic, loot, and sandbox drop for the game in this season? When you stop innovating in those ways, players notice it, and I think this is one of the big things that's happening over time with Destiny content at the moment. Here's another very small example. So what if seasonal exotic armor, the 3 that we had this season, what if they weren't random drops, but instead also had exotic armor catalysts with uniquely themed perks around the Warmind? And then what if those armors dropped from the Seraph Towers, like the ciphers that we saw in Prison of Elders in D1, which could then be upgraded to get the additional benefit of the perk, becoming noticeably more powerful? Again, a very specific idea, and not a specific request, but these are the kinds of small innovations, be them in the loot system, or precisely how we gain XP, or how we gain power. It's a kind of similar situation for a handful of Destiny 2's problems. And of course, one single introduction, like the things that we've spoken about, isn't likely to save an entire season, is it? And so even more so, I think it highlights why Bungie are going to have to think about how they can iterate a little bit differently in the future. So give us your thoughts on all of that stuff, but more on the side of PvE. Although it hasn't actually launched yet, the Grandmaster Ordeal was also disappointed players based on the early look and details that Bungie gave to us. Initially, I think it's really cool that we actually get a unique title for this kind of content. That in itself is awesome, but I totally feel the burn of not getting any kind of interesting or unique drops from these strikes specifically, which outside of power modifiers and things like that, is definitely the #1 piece of feedback. Overall here, when speaking about the seasons, we know that it does mean we get more regular content than what we had back in Destiny 1. However, often the amount of content, but particularly the quality, and I think especially on the investment side for that content, outside of the PvP side of the game, which we're going to speak about now, these are significant problems that Bungie have to try and tackle and adapt for, especially if the game is going to survive into a year 4. Absolutely, that is my hope for Destiny, but however that works, however that happens, you know, I'm not a game developer, but yeah, I'm just not sure that Destiny can survive unless Bungie find different ways to do things or more resources to do them with. I'm not sure which one it is that they really need. Once again, be sure to let us know what you think in the comment section. But moving on to one of the main content offerings this season, it was the long-awaited return of Trials, and it already feels like this isn't really in a very good place. So initially, for PC players, there are a lot of reports of cheating, and this has been an increasingly nasty problem since the move to Steam, and with the game being free to play now as well. I should mention that nobody says that with any kind of aggression or animosity to New Light players in general. Certainly not here, but the number of cheaters inside of PvP, especially Trials on PC, it's safe to say is now ruining the experience of a lot of players, and is strictly unfun and horribly unhealthy for the PvP ecosystem on the whole. In addition, for a multitude of reasons, player numbers in Trials have been dropping, and even on console, early card games now seem relatively difficult versus how it was in D1. And a lot of players agree that Trials, or specifically Flawless, shouldn't be an easy thing to do, but it seems that large numbers of players are actually turning away from Trials really fast in D2. And so folks are complaining about token farming type behaviors, as well as low numbers of players actually achieving reward thresholds. And then, separate to loot and flawless rewards specifically, we've also had the disappointing loot bugs, which have locked players out of rewards temporarily, plus repeated disconnect issues. So it's rough, man, out there in Trials, but signs say that it's getting rougher, and that is absolutely a shame for the launch of something so relatively anticipated, right? Bungie reprised the rewards for Trials. There was also feedback about having adept rewards and enough flawless exclusive rewards initially, and that's totally something that Bungie need to work on, although most of the attention does seem now to be focusing much more around Trials matchmaking, match quality, player decline, and whether it's been bugs or cheaters, generally it feels like a lot of folks are having quite a bit less fun this time around. So again, there are a number of reasons that that's happening, but it remains a problem for Bungie to try and solve. But nonetheless, I would love to hear from you guys. What has your Trials experience been? Do you really see yourself continuing to play Trials, especially in another few weeks from now, right? Trials has only been with us for a month. And I do definitely worry about where Trials is going to be, in 4 or 6 weeks from now, especially. It's another department where a lot of work is needed. Overall, guys, I think while lots of seasonal stuff is indeed working still, and it may not sound like that's my opinion based on this video, but overall, clearly Destiny players are simply used to getting more, right? Be it more content, higher quality content, and better reasons to actually invest into the game. Again, aside of PvP's ongoing issues, the emergence of considerable amounts of cheating on PC, the PvE side of the game feels like it's also ticking along pretty predictably. And combining the problems in those ecosystems is where I think a lot of veteran players now know that seasons need both formulaic change with less structural predictability, but also I think a focus on investment quality, especially for a year 4 going forward, is going to be huge. I've said it already recently, but despite of all of these conversations right now, realistically, for next season we aren't really likely to see any significant changes. Of course, we'll get new content. It could be a bit better than this season. Who knows, it could be a bit less good than this season, but I certainly hope it's the former. However, nonetheless, like the previous 2 seasons, even in comparison to Black Armory or Season of Opulence, I think we're going to see a similar contrast, right? And I know a lot of you guys kind of know that and are going to feel that way, but some folks may say, hey, you all have complaints, but Bungie are doing the best, and we shouldn't be harsh about the game. And again, I would say that there is a balance to strike here, right? As invested players, especially when we're seeing things moving away from where we really want them to be, it is totally our job to push as much of this feedback to Bungie as possible. And from there, only Bungie can really utilize and examine that info to make the appropriate decisions. So we can't expect that we can solve Destiny's problems, but we have been and will be the biggest fundamental driver of change and giving Bungie the direction that they need, if that change is going to happen, right? So once again, be sure to give Bungie your feedback, be sure to give your thoughts on where you're at with Destiny, guys. I appreciate you listening to this rather long rant potentially here, but I think it's all important stuff to talk about. And where there are specific issues that you already want to highlight, of course you can do that in the comment section. But if you've broadly enjoyed the video, a rating down below is very much appreciated. If you're new around here and you do want to be kept up to date with the world of Destiny, because yes, we will still be making Destiny content for the foreseeable future here on the channel, then feel free to hit subscribe and you can turn on notifications if you want to be kept up to date. But otherwise for today, thanks for tuning in, guys. Be sure to stay safe, and whatever you get up to, I hope you have an awesome day.